country on edge. The $200 million demand by ISIS in exchange for two Japanese hostages expired overnight. A mother now begging for her son's life as the fate of those two men remains unknown. The militant group posting a new video online saying the countdown to kill those men has started. Right now, the international hotspot, Japan. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan in New York. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe convened his National Security Council today to discuss how to handle this crisis. ABC's Karen Travers has the latest now from Washington.
ISIS demanded $200 million from the Japanese government in exchange for the release of two Japanese hostages. The deadline for that ransom payment has passed, with no word on the hostages' fate.
We pray that two Japanese citizens to be released from the terrorist group.
Overnight in Tokyo, the mother of one of the hostages making a last-minute emotional plea for ISIS to spare her son. Her son is a respected Japanese television reporter, Kenji Goto. He traveled to Syria last year. His colleagues described him as careful.
He's not a gung-ho war journalist. He cares about humanity.
Before he went, Goto left behind this video saying only he was to blame if he was captured by ISIS. The other Japanese hostage is Haruna Yukawa, a self-described adventurer. He was captured by ISIS last year and accused of being an American spy. If ISIS goes through with its threats, that would be 7 hostages killed by the alleged executioner called Jihadi John because of his British accent.
You now have 72 hours to pressure your government in making a wise decision.
That same masked man is believed to have been the executioner in the murders of Americans James Foley, Steve Sotloff, and Peter Kassig, and Brits David Haynes and Alan Henning. U.S. and British officials say they know the identity of Jihadi John, but they're not making it public as they look for ways to capture or kill him. Karen Travers, ABC News, Washington.
I want to switch now and bring in our crime and terror analyst, Brad Garrett in Washington, D.C. And Brad, I want to ask you about this. How seriously is Japan taking this warning?
Well, I would presume, Dan, quite seriously. ISIS has not hesitated in the past to execute people based on deadlines. So I'm going to make some presumptions here that we're not really sure when the 72 hours started. So has it passed? Has it not passed? If they are still alive, I would think the following: that the Japanese have been able to talk to ISIS. Maybe they're negotiating a way out of this. Maybe they're negotiating the price. There could be a number of things going on that would support that we haven't heard from ISIS in a number of hours.
What do we not, Brad, we've talked about this before. There is significance to this $200 million ransom. What is that?
Well, because it's such an outrageous amount of money, and many terrorist organizations, and this really started going into big bucks with the Somalis hijacking ships and holding the ship and the crew for a lot of money. And so, I think it's whatever the traffic will bear, and I, obviously the Japanese could pay $200 million. The question is, will they? They have not formally said one way or the other. Like, clearly the United States has a policy to not pay. They may negotiate, but it's not going to be over money. So the Japanese sound like they're maybe in the middle on that, and we'll have to see sort of how this plays out. But I also think ISIS, if in fact they've executed them, would not be bashful about telling us that.
Which has been, as you pointed out, Brad, it has been a hallmark trait of how they have been doing this before. You said that there is some uncertainty as far as when that 72-hour time frame may actually be starting and when it may ending. If, in fact, the Japanese are negotiating with ISIS on this, what does that look like then behind the scenes?
Well, it's obviously an intermediary. The Japanese probably are not directly talking to ISIS. They either have a contact in Japan or in some other part of the world that has a link or a communication to ISIS. And that person is the one basically doing the negotiating on the behalf of the Japanese. And so this may be a back and forth. I guess I'd be surprised if ISIS would lower the price, only because they can basically ask whatever they want to ask. And in the past, you're looking at a number of scenarios, Dan, where, in particularly, the French have paid a lot of money, several $1 million at a time, to get hostages released. So I think ISIS is looking at that going, we'll just keep going up, and you're going to pay it, or we're going to kill your hostages. And, it's really worked for them in the past.
What then from this video that we're seeing then is the intelligence community in Japan and maybe elsewhere around the world taking away from this that might possibly be different from those previous videos?
Well, every time you get a video, Dan, you try to, first of all, assess, is it legitimate? Is it shot where they claim it's being shot? For example, let's look at this, the background behind these two most recent hostages from Japan. Looks like maybe the Syrian desert. I guess it could be the Iraqi desert. But, the question is that real? Is it a green screen where they are really in a studio someplace? They project the desert behind them. There's some argument among the experts, and I'm just sort of talking here that we don't really know, that the lighting is such that it wouldn't be how the sun would reflect off of both of them. The wind is not blowing. I mean, if you spend any time in the desert, there's a lot of constant wind that would affect the mics on Jihad John and anybody else that might be around. It's very clear. It's like they're in a place where there is no other noise. So now let's presume that's true. I mean, it doesn't really change the scenario. It's just ISIS basically letting you know, or us know, that we aren't where it appears we are, which would, sort of further cloak the location of both the executioner as well as the hostages.
Well, so you had mentioned the possibility of being in Syria, and we've seen some reports, in fact, that these two men traveled to Syria before they're captured. Do we know why? What was their initial purpose?
Well, based on reporting from Japan only, apparently one gentleman who is a journalist of sorts went to ISIS, supposedly was captured. I'm not really sure if he wanted to join them, if he wanted to cover them, but be that what it may, they didn't believe him. They've turned him into a prisoner. And then the second gentleman apparently leaves Japan thinking he can come and rescue the first one. And obviously that didn't work out.
Now, we're looking at this video, and if in fact ISIS does go through this and the execution occurs, this would then bring the total number of people killed to 7 by this Jihad John. What do we know about him? I know that there's been voice analysis done.
There's a lot of speculation that we even know the identity of Jihad John. I've had some conversations with people who would know, claiming that is the case, that they have a name, they know where he's from, but they're not going to talk about it publicly. And the reason why is the following. If you're trying to capture somebody or figure out their location, the last thing you really want them to know is that you are looking for a particular person with a particular name. Because as people travel and move around, you want them to stay in a routine, because a routine will at least give you sort of common things that happen each day in their lives. Where do they eat? Where do they sleep? Where do they live? Who do they associate with? And so, my guess is they're really trying to draw a bead into, where is this guy? Can we actually geolocate him? And so as a result, and I guarantee you that is going on. I don't know if they're successful or not, but they will continue to do that. And my guess is we'll not hear anything about Jihad John one way or the other unless he's dead or in custody.
Brad, I want to ask you, the U.S. involvement, is there any as far as providing any kind of intelligence or even negotiation support or any kind of even manpower behind this with Japan?
Well, my sense would be, because Japan really doesn't have a footprint, so to speak, in the Middle East. They had an embassy in Syria. They pulled out when Syria uh, started having problems a number of years ago. So probably what would happen if there were decent intel where they were, it was possible they could be rescued. I think the Japanese would come to us, the US, and ask us because obviously we're in place. We've done it before, um, and we might help them. I don't know. The other side of that, Dan, is that we would be feeding the Japanese intelligence as we get it in reference to their hostages. Because we have a relationship with them, a diplomatic relationship, and so clearly we would like to help them get these two guys back. It's just, as we've experienced in recent months, extremely difficult to know where they are, and do you have enough time to actually go get them? As we've had in some recent hostage situations where we've tried to go get them, and the information was just a little too old and they had been moved.
ABC's crime and terror analyst Brad Garrett in Washington. Brad, thank you for that. You can keep up with this story in real time by downloading the ABC News app and starring the story for exclusive updates on the go. This is the International Hotspot. I'm Dan Kleffler in New York.